Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by Spectator TV and broadcast on Thursday, the 24th of August. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner leader, has been killed in a plane crash along with 10 other men on board. Reports suggest that the plane was shot down when entering Russian airspace. What does this mean for internal fighting and the war in Ukraine? Owen Matthews joins me on the show. My colleague Svitlana Morenets has been in Ukraine investigating some first aid delivery on the front line. Thousands of troops are dying from wounds, she reports, when some could be saved with proper medical equipment. She joins me on the show. It was the first Republican presidential primary debate last night, and its winner wasn't even there. In his cover story this week, Freddy Gray says that Donald Trump no longer needs the TV networks to be the lead story. He has his own movement, his own media, and his own brand. Freddy and former Congressman Devin Nunes, now head of Trump's social media platform Truth Social, join me later. Here in the UK, it may be recess, but the Tory party's elections are well underway. The Tories have been picking local candidates to stand in the coming elections. Is this the best strategy? James Heale and Spectator contributor Patrick O'Flynn speak to Spectator TV. And finally, Disney princesses are for many of us a fond memory of childhood. But how relevant are they to today's children? And is Snow White the latest victim of the culture war? Katherine Dee joins me on the show. Before we get going, if you like Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Spectator TV is picking up thousands of new subscribers every week, and you should be one of them. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. First up, today's reports about the death of Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin may not come as a surprise to most. In fact, some wonder how the man who rebelled against Putin survived as long as he did. What does this attack tell us about Putin's grip on power? Joining me now is our Russia correspondent, Owen Matthews. Hi, Owen. Thanks for joining Spectator TV. You say in your piece for Coffee House that Yevgeny Prigozhin was a dead man walking. Why was that?
Well, for a very simple reason that if you defy someone as who had the track record of murder and violence like Vladimir Putin, who's either directly or indirectly killed so many of his opponents, if you actually come after a man like that in an armed insurrection, I mean, it's pretty clear that the stakes cannot have been higher for him. It's kind of amazing that he survived the Prigozhin survived the mutiny. It's amazing that he was allowed to sort of walk the earth, especially the Russian earth, in the 2 months intervening. So in that sense, Prigozhin's death is probably like the least surprising news story of the year.
From Putin's perspective, Owen, to what extent did the Wagner chief still represent a threat? Or was killing Prigozhin simply an act of revenge for the attempted coup several months back?
Well, I think both. The threat part, I think, has actually been more or less neutralized insofar as that Wagner was partially the Wagner troops that rebelled under Prigozhin's orders back in June who have been scattered. Some of them have gone to Belarus, some of them have gone to Africa. We don't know how many have joined up various regular Russian army units like Redut, which is a Russian army unit set up especially for former prisoners. So I don't think Prigozhin was necessarily a military threat, but the fact that he was still at liberty was a sort of living proof of Putin's weakness. And in that sense, the really important question is, how much of his supporters are still out there. I mean, there's been some chat on pro-Wagner Telegram groups saying, we will get revenge. We've had a plan, for this eventuality, watch out, Kremlin. We have no idea how serious those are. I think most people discount the possibility of a second Wagner mutiny, just Wagner. But the bigger question is, what about all the soldiers, generals, and officers, security service people, bloggers who supported Prigozhin? And why did they support Prigozhin? They supported Prigozhin because Prigozhin, they thought, was the only guy really fighting a serious war in Ukraine, while all the rest were being incompetent and stealing, which is probably true. Some kind of new head of this Hydra is kind of going to be dangerous and threatening to Putin going forward, because if the war doesn't go very well, there's going to be other people who thought like Prigozhin did, and we can't exclude that they're going to appear on the political scene at some point in the future.
Well, that was my next question to you. Does this death leave an opening for somebody even more frightening to come in?
Yes, it certainly does. The most dangerous opposition to Putin is not liberals and anti-war voices like Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who's been spent 2 years in jail. That's not the dangerous opposition. The dangerous opposition are the ultra-nationalists and the hawks, who argue that Putin is sort of pussyfooting about and not doing enough to prosecute the Ukraine war. And they've been the most vocal opponents of Putin, the most vocal critics. One of their most prominent voices of the ultra-nationalists is a guy called Igor Strilkov. His real name is Girkin, former defense minister of the separatist Donetsk People's Republic. And he was jailed last month. So that guy has been shut down. But there is a large, we don't know how large, but definitely vocal community of nationalists in Russia who actually have strong ties and support in the armed forces. We know that. So they're armed, they're angry, and they are opposed to Putin. So the last showdown was obviously the Prigozhin mutiny. It failed. Putin won. He survived. Prigozhin's dead. Putin is not. So, that round goes to Putin. But I think the big takeaway for anyone who has plans to challenge Putin from the Prigozhin mutiny is that Putin's word means nothing. Putin gave his word to Prigozhin. That was the reason why he was in Russia. He just thought, Prigozhin thought that it was going to be business as usual. It was definitely not business as usual. He seems to be the only person in the world that kind of considered Putin's word to be good, and Putin broke it. So the real takeaway is, if you come at the Tsar, you better finish the job next time round.
Oh, and you mentioned before that Prigozhin still walking around Russia would have represented a symbol of sorts for Putin of his own weakness. Is that why we saw such a public assassination? Putin's regime has made us very familiar with the concept of accidental deaths, but this was extremely public. Was he trying to make a statement?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, there is something deliberately performative about this spectacular act of violence. I mean, he wasn't just, poisoned. He wasn't, killed in a car crash. Prigozhin was literally blown out of the sky. So there's, clear symbolism to that. Part of the symbolism is this was apparently, I mean, we don't know quite yet, but there have been witness reports that suggest that there were 2 anti-aircraft missiles that downed Prigozhin's plane. So it's like the military killed Prigozhin. So that's a symbolism. He was killed, violently in a fireball, along with many of the senior members of the Wagner group, notably Dmitry Utkin, formerly the commander and head of Wagner group, whose call sign Wagner is actually because he's an enthusiastic Nazi. You may have noticed that actually late Putin Russia seems to share a casting director with like the Lord of the Rings, because these people are like incredibly terrifying looking. Dmitry Utkin literally looks like the king of the orcs and has swastika SS swastika flashes tattooed on his collarbone. Prigozhin, as we know, also looks pretty scary. But all of these people were traveling together. All of the top Wagner people, they were killed in what military people call a decapitation strike. But of course, it's quite telling that the most successful decapitation strikes that the Russian state is currently carrying out are on its own side.
So what happens to the Wagner group now, Owen, that has lost so many of its senior officials?
I think it's just going to be taken over by greedy Russian officers. I mean, for many years, Wagner has actually been a kind of, it's like passing go on the monopoly board. A lot of top Russian commanders actually were seconded, spent 6 months with Wagner in Africa, in Syria, made a lot of money. That was how Wagner actually became so influential among the senior high command. And in fact, one of the top commanders of Wagner was in fact literally a former deputy defense minister of the Russian Federation. So there's, there are a lot of people who have benefited from this cash cow now that because Wagner has been very busy, hoovering up, gold mines, assets, gas wells in all the countries, from Niger to Central African Republic to Libya to Syria, where it's had operations. I think our business empire is just going to be absorbed by, vultures. In terms of its continuing existence as a threat to Putin, I don't think it's actually going to be reconstituted in its old form. It can't be. And that just leaves a sort of a major gap in the sort of fighting in the line of battle in Ukraine, because Prigozhin, for all of his many legion faults, was actually indeed one of the most effective battlefield commanders around Soledar and Bakhmut, and one of the few Russian generals that was actually able to deliver some kind of victory, however bloody it was, but that's now gone.
So
there's now no one else.
So you do think that this assassination will essentially have a direct effect on Putin's war against Ukraine?
The effect already happened after the mutiny, and when Wagner was essentially sort of dispersed and officially taken over by the Russian state. So Wagner hasn't been in the line of battle for some time, not in fact since the end of May. It's not really the issue of Wagner fighting forces. It's the effect on the Russian war effort, I think, is going to be more about, how is Putin going to, where is Putin going to get his cannon fodder from? Because Wagner was a really important source of cannon fodder. They recruited, as we know, tens of thousands of violent criminals, including murderers and rapists, and offered them unconditional discharge after 6 months of service. So you have a cannon fodder problem, and you have a who to blame problem, because the arguments that Putin, that Prigozhin made, and the criticism he made of the Russian high command, all those things that he said have not been addressed, not been fixed, that the army is corrupt, it's inefficient, they don't know how to fight. All of those things are true. So if the operation still continues to go wrong, or rather if they still, continue to lose bits and pieces of ground to the Ukrainians, then Putin's going to have to come up with a new narrative, someone else to blame.
My last question to you, Owen, was something interesting that stuck out in your piece, where you wrote that Prigozhin's assassination could actually be interpreted as a sign of weakness from Vladimir Putin. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, weakness insofar as in the sort of mafia-like world of the inner circle of Putin's closest associates, what's most important is personal trust. They value loyalty above everything. And part of that loyalty is giving your word. So let's just imagine for a second this actually is literally a mafia family. The boss has made a deal with a discontented capo, a lieutenant who's rebelled and been forgiven and is, has his guard down, and then you assassinate him while his guard is down. You've broken your word. What does that do to your negotiating capabilities in future with your other capos? Clearly what you've done is you've just murdered a man who trusted you. So in that sense, in the terms of, the what the Russians call понятия, the understandings, not the laws, but the understandings that govern that sort of world of the high elite, Putin has actually just gone back on his word and proved himself to be fundamentally untrustworthy. And I think that is, if not necessarily a sign of weakness, it's a sign of his, it's going to weaken him in future. The weakness is really that it fails. It proves that Russia is a failed state that has no mechanism other than murder to punish its wrongdoers. That's really the sign of weakness.
Owen, thanks for joining Spectator TV.
My great pleasure.
Next, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers on the front line are being wounded. Where have the resources for first aid gone? Svitlana Morenets joins me now. Hi, Svitlana. Great to see you. You're still in Kyiv.
Yes, hi.
And I want to speak about your article for the magazine this week. But before we get into that, we've just heard from Owen Matthews about the death of Prigozhin. And Svitlana, I wanted to hear from you what the Ukrainian reaction is.
Yes, of course. Zelensky hasn't said anything yet about what happened to Prigozhin, but his advisor, Podolyak, said that he hinted that Putin was the one who ordered the murder of Prigozhin, and he said that it will lead to even more internal fighting in Russia, and that with this move, Putin is showing that the next year, during the elections, nobody can stand next to him, that he is the only one Tsar in Russia, and nobody can just try to march to Moscow and overthrow it. So he prefers right now to use fear to all of his people in his team, and it can make problems for him because they will be afraid, and that means they will be less loyal to him. So maybe they will think about what can they do to save their lives and to protect them, and maybe to overthrow Putin. But these are also fantasies for Ukraine a bit, because even with Prigozhin was the only one who was capable of doing that, because he had an army behind him, he had Wagner mercenaries and the weapons. But 2 months ago, he lost his chance, and maybe if he walked up to the Kremlin, he would be heading Russia right now. But he didn't do that, and he paid with his life for that.
Svitlana, I want to pivot to your article in the magazine this week where you write about witnessing some of the terrible injuries sustained by Ukrainian troops on the edge of the Donetsk region. Can you tell me what you saw and under what circumstances?
I went to the edge of the Donetsk region with a Ukrainian medic volunteer battalion called Hospitaliers. They were evacuating injured soldiers who were handed to them by the combat medics, and their task was to keep them alive till they bring them to the hospital in Dnipro. So the soldiers were injured already for 5 hours when we received them, and we spent 4 hours more to bring them to the hospital. So it is almost 10 hours long evacuation. And this is a very common case in Ukraine right now.
Svitlana, why doesn't the rest of the world know about the exact number of Ukrainian casualties?
Ukraine doesn't say about its casualties because they say it helps to avoid that the enemy knows about how many people Ukraine lost and build the plans according to that. So they say, okay, it is a secret information, we will disclose it only after the war ends. But it prevents scrutiny, because as Ukrainians don't know how many died, they don't know if the soldiers received all they needed when they were injured, and maybe some of them could have been saved, because when I talked to the medical staff who works on the front line, they said that many soldiers die not because not on the front line when they were injured. They died during the evacuation because there was no evacuation transport. There were no medical kits to help them, or the components inside of those medical kits were bad quality. For example, tourniquets, the devices to stop the bleeding. They are Chinese ones, and they are very cheap, but they come apart, they lose pressure, and the soldier dies. So right now it is a question, are the injured soldiers treated as well as they must be in Ukraine right now? And of course, Ukrainian government, they are focused on the counteroffensive and asking weapons from the allies, and the focus swifted from the soldiers when they are injured. Okay, they already made their task, they fought in the war, and now they are not needed by the state. And it shouldn't be like that.
Svitlana, can you talk a little bit more about the corruption in this area of first aid provision?
Yes, corruption has been always a problem in Ukraine, but during the last weeks, the news emerged about the member of Ukrainian medical forces that he supplied the Chinese tourniquets of low quality, and they sent them to the front line. And he also said that they were NATO standards, so he bought them from the company owned by his daughter-in-law at inflated prices. And right now it is been under investigation and he has been fired. But these 11,000 Chinese medical kits were already sent to the soldiers. So we can just imagine if they were not taken away, these kits, if the soldiers didn't see that they are bad quality and they were unfortunately injured and they use them, I can imagine how many of them died because of this case of the corruption. And it is not the only one, because, for example, last year in Lviv, medical kits supplied by American volunteers just disappeared. These were 10,000 medical kits, and they could save the lives of 10,000 soldiers. But they disappeared. Maybe they were later resolved. I don't know this, and I know that the US is currently investigating this case. And these are just only two examples of what is happening. And of course, I wouldn't like it to sound like all the help Ukraine receives is being resolved, or Ukraine is just full of corruption and nobody helps the soldier. But because it is not like that. But unfortunately, we have these cases when it really happens. And because of that, our soldier died. And right now, when I was traveling around the front line, I was talking to soldiers and they were telling me that brigades have not enough people to fight in. So because volunteers ended and the conscription is going on, but it is not enough, and Ukraine is losing a lot of people, and it has less people than Russia. So every life matters, not because just only every life matters, but because Ukraine doesn't have many people to fight. And we don't know how long this war is going to last for. And if we have the opportunity to help the injured soldiers, and later, if the injury is not so heavy, they can come back to the front line, we should do it. It's not just because, of course, it's because of the principles, because we have to take care of the people, but it is also about the war effort. So it is in the interest of Ukrainian government that the soldiers receive all the medical kits and the transport that they need to evacuate them if they were injured.
Speaking of transport, you also mentioned in the piece that due to a lot of bureaucracy that's severely limiting transport at the moment, that is impacting how quickly soldiers can be seen by medical professionals. In such a state of emergency, surely that red tape is not necessary.
Yes, the problem is that the reforms that are needed to be made, the problem is that the reforms that Ukraine needs to make in the peacetime, they would take years to make, because all this bureaucracy comes from the Soviet era, and Ukraine needs to change a lot of laws, and in a state of the war, it's very difficult to do all of that. And the focus right now is on receiving more weapons and fighting and liberating the lands. So, but the problem is that every evacuation transport that Ukrainian troops receive, or every medical kit, has to be, if it gets used or destroyed or something happens, it has to be written off. But it takes up to 6 months to do that, because the official investigations must be carried on. A lot of paperwork is needed. And imagine that the soldiers are fighting, they used a medical kit, they used a tourniquet, they stopped the bleeding, and then someone had to spend weeks to write off the tourniquet and to say that it wasn't stolen or something. The control over it is needed, like to say how they used the cars, how they use the medical supplies, but the process of reporting it should be much faster than it is right now, because 6 months of doing that is something unimaginable, and that's why the combat medics I talked to told me that they prefer to take the help from volunteers, from Ukrainians who donate money, buy them the cars for evacuation, buy medical kits, and to use them rather than use the help from the government, because the help received from volunteers, they don't need to write it off. They just can use it and keep going with the war, But the help from the government, they need to make a lot of paperwork. So they prefer, okay, we are not going to take this thing from the government. And also the problem that Ukraine receives a lot of medical kits from abroad, and our allies, unfortunately, don't always know what is better to send. And sometimes they think better to buy a lot of Chinese tourniquets than good American ones that are like 10 times more expensive. They think, okay, we buy more, then we help more soldiers. But it doesn't work like that, because bad quality medical kits, they kill the soldiers. But Kyiv doesn't have any standards and for checking those medical kits. They just send them directly, they receive them and send them directly to the front line without any checks. And when senior medics complain about the quality, Kyiv is not allowed to complain to allies, because, as you know, Zelensky already was called a lot of times ungrateful, that we don't thank enough our allies. So Ukraine never complains about what we are receiving, actually. And it is not only about medical kits, it's also about cars. Sometimes they arrive to Ukraine completely unusable, and Ukraine has to remake them completely so they work. They can actually work at the front line.
Svitlana, thanks for the update, and thanks for joining me on Spectator TV.
Thank you.
Last night was the first Republican presidential debate. 8 candidates took to the stage and debated topics like climate change and abortion. But the main topic of discussion was the candidate who didn't show up. Take a look.
But we are going to take a brief moment and talk about the elephant not in the room.
Former President Trump has been indicted in 4 different states on 91 counts. He will be processed tomorrow in Georgia at the Fulton County Jail for charges relating to the 2020 election loss.
You all signed a pledge to support the eventual Republican nominee. If former President Trump is convicted in a court of law, would you still support him as your party's choice? Please raise your hand if you would. Just hold on.
Missing candidate Donald Trump was, at the same time, speaking to broadcaster Tucker Carlson on his show for X, formerly known as Twitter, where he gave this reason for not appearing in the TV debates. Take a look.
Mr. President, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Why aren't you at the Fox News debate tonight in Milwaukee?
Well, a lot of people have been asking me that, and many people said you shouldn't do them, but you see the polls have come out, and I'm leading by 50 and 60 points. And, some of them are at 1 and 0 and 2. And I'm saying, do I sit there for an hour or 2 hours, whatever it's going to be, and get harassed by people that shouldn't even be running for president? Should I be doing that? And a network that isn't particularly friendly to me, frankly. They were backing Ron DeSanctimonious like crazy, and now they've given up on him. I mean, it's a lost cause.
For the cover piece this week, Freddy Gray takes a look at Trump's decision not to appear in the TV debates. His argument, in short, is that Trump is the story whether he appears or not. Joining me now is Freddy Gray and Devin Nunes, head of Trump's social media platform, Truth Social. Freddy, write the cover for this week's magazine about Trump Vision. He's the only show in town, you say, so much so that he doesn't have to take part in the national debate. He's still present. Talk us through your piece.
Well, I think what happened in 2015, and particularly in the Republican candidate debates in 2015, is that Trump sort of set fire to the nomination process in many ways, and particularly the media side of it, because these debates, admittedly, they don't draw in the same kind of numbers as the big final 2 showdown presidential one just before the election. But they were always considered very important sort of starting blocks for candidates to lay out their stall, to say who they were, and more importantly, to sort of pay fealty to the huge TV networks that would then honour that fealty by projecting them into the national consciousness. Trump in 2015 took over the national and to some extent the global consciousness, and certainly the media. This year, something similar but different is happening, in that he is now shunning the networks to some extent. The TV debates, he's not going to do them. And it doesn't really seem to matter because the power relationship has changed and the power of news TV has changed, because to some extent the Trump story is the story of how the media misunderstood their role in politics and thought that they could stop this political phenomenon, and they couldn't. And now, as we approach 2024, we're seeing just quite clearly how little they matter.
Devin, Freddie writes in his piece that he wasn't surprised that Donald Trump decided not to take part in these debates. Were you surprised? And do you think this changes the game for presidential elections in the future?
Well, for those of us who have followed politics closely here in America for a long time, it didn't make any sense for President Trump to participate in the debates. And the main reason why is that we haven't really been here as a country, meaning the United States, where you have a president who left office who still claimed his title as the Republican Party leader. And even though I think that some of the Republicans in the Beltway, the lobbyists and the Wall Street people, they don't like that, but the facts are the facts, and that is that President Trump has built the biggest political movement in modern American history, bar none. There is no doubt of that. And plus, what you won't hear the Republican Party leader say is that they had to have President Trump in the last election cycle because without them, they couldn't raise any money on their own. Because what President Trump did is he bypassed, as Freddie, I think, eloquently puts in his piece, he bypassed all the norms, went straight to the American people, and developed what the Democrats had been working on for years, which is small dollars, millions of them all over the country. And so, with that, and with President Trump fighting the election results, with him staying out there on the campaign trail, with him out there doing rallies, it's impossible, as a guy who served, 2 decades in Congress, I may be proud I'm elected and I may be the leader of a committee or the leader of the Senate. But guess what? If you don't have the people and you can't raise the money, you're basically a leader without any followers. President Trump is a leader with more followers than any political player in modern history. So therefore, why would you put yourself in a position where you've got, half the candidates, that are up there are not, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but they're, they have every right to run, but they're not serious candidates. They have no chance to win. And if President Trump, matter of fact, I'm not sure that any of the candidates that are out there today, if President Trump was just to say, hey, see you guys later, I'm going to go play golf in Florida, have fun with your politics, my guess is that none of those candidates would ultimately be the Republican nominee. So when you have the votes sewed up, there is no reason to entertain, kind of the chaotic wannabe people that most likely would not be the nominee anyway if President Trump wasn't there.
Speaking of followers, of course, you're representing Truth Social, and I'm interested in your views on the influence of social media at the moment compared to, say, those mainstream television shows and indeed the debates. Donald Trump is talking about spending time on X, the new version of Twitter. He's talking about going to Truth Social, where he says he's going to make his case instead of doing these TV debates. And I think it's interesting that he's decided to almost pit them against each other. And it does reflect in some ways, I suppose, how people consume their news now.
Yeah, and if you look at it, the landscape has just changed from 2016. And it evolved rapidly after that 16 election. So President Trump successfully used the social media, specifically Facebook, really was the main one. Of course, he would put his message out on Twitter back in 16, but really he was using Facebook because he was live streaming his rallies. And at that time, you have to remember, in 16, there was, on the conservative center-right, there was essentially Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, Sean Hannity, 4 or 5 of the talk radio hosts. And then there were regional talk radio hosts and some of the center-right magazines, that sort of thing. But it was maybe 10 or 15 majors that you had to deal with. Well, in 16, President Trump went around all that because he was going to Twitter and going on Facebook, live streaming his rallies, and a candidate with really not very much money beat the most favored candidate in U.S. history by the mainstream by using social media. Now, what happened after 2016? Outside of Obama destroying our justice system and putting a president under investigation by the Obama Justice Department and intelligence agencies, outside of that, in 2016, shortly after the election, a lot of people forget this, but the term fake news, a lot of people think Donald Trump made up that term fake news. Actually, the two prominent players to mention fake news well before Donald Trump were two gentlemen you guys have probably know. One was a guy named Barack Obama right after the election that said it was fake news on the internet that allowed Donald Trump to win. And it was a guy by the name of Mark Zuckerberg, who then in 2020 decided to spend nearly $500 million of his own money. So what happened since that time period of fake news? Well, one thing, Donald Trump took that phrase, hoisted it back on the fake news, and now you got 70-80% of Americans who don't believe any of the news, and I agree they shouldn't, because they either are fake because they're owned by a billionaire who has an agenda, multiple billionaires, or they're a publicly financed company. A government funded, which means they got to be woke to get their government funding. And then you just have a small handful center right, maybe less than 5%, that tries to get the real story out.
Fred, I want to pick up on this question of what constitutes fake news and also what constitutes fake allegations. And you address some of this in your piece. You talk about Russiagate, and you say that for a lot of Americans on the right, but not necessarily on the right, they watch what happened around those allegations, which were proven essentially false, that Trump was somehow working with Vladimir Putin in order to rig the 2016 election. And now they see all these other accusations, and regardless of elements of truth that may well be behind them, they're simply not listening. They've decided to lump all of what they consider to be fake news together. Now, this works to Donald Trump's advantage as he's facing many of those allegations. Arguably, it also gives him an argument to avoid serious scrutiny because the allegations go, well, for years, he had these questions put to him, which, in retrospect, looks silly. Now, if anyone wants to put serious questions to him, they're also going to be considered silly. Whether that's right or wrong, however, I think is very much up for debate. And the fact that he isn't showing up to these debates and the fact that he isn't going to be scrutinized in that way, maybe that won't sit quite right with Republican voters. A lot of primary voters, the majority certainly do wish he was showing up.
Yes, the vast majority do want him to go to the debates. I think 73%, according to one poll of Trump supporters, want him to be at the debate. But that's for the very simple reason that they want to watch Trump Vision. They want to watch the Trump show. And without him, it's quite boring. On the legal side, just to pick on what Devin said, I think he's right to point out that, the Democrats were talking about fake news before the Trumpists and the Trump gang did. But I think it was Kellyanne Conway, Devin, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, that really sort of projected the term into the national consciousness when she started talking about it. But as for the legal side, I think at the moment, obviously, it is helping him in the polls. It's boosted him in the polls. There is a concern, even among people who are close to Trump. Devin is closer to Trump than a lot of people, so he can probably tell us. But there is concern about the practical effect it's going to have on his campaign. This is an enormous amount of work that he will have to get through. As the criminal defendant, he will have to get through it while running a presidential campaign. Can he do that? I think already you're seeing Trump and the people around him building this as part of their victory narrative. That people like to emphasize his superhuman energy levels, and he does seem to have extraordinary energy levels, particularly for a 77-year-old man. And you can see that this will be the contrast, will be between frail, doddery, old Joe Biden and Trump facing this astronomical challenge of running for the presidency, probably the most stressful thing any human being can do, on top of nearly 100 criminal charges, on top of facing nearly 100 criminal charges. And that will be the story, I think, which will be look at what he's getting through, and he's still doing it. That's assuming he can still do it, because it is an extraordinary amount of work to have to get through.
Devin, can you give us some insight into what the president's thinking 2024 is going to look like?
Well, look, I think the main thing that he wanted to make sure, and I think when I was in London last year when we launched Truth Social, that was the number one question that I kept getting was, well, is Trump going to run? And he was very transparent. He said, look, I want to make sure that I'm in good health, and he is in amazing health, as Freddie said. I mean, he just goes and goes and goes, works all day, 7 days a week, till late hours of the evening, early in the morning. And, that I think it resonates, with the American people. And you got to remember, as much as the fake news and the left have tried to kind of place over Trump, continually, and it's the most ridiculous thing, and I think it's what they all miss, is that they love to say things like, well, it's just a personality. They're just following the individual. Well, what they forget that Donald Trump is rooted in something that goes back for decades that is very near and dear to him. And from the first time that I actually met him and spent time with him when he was campaigning out in California, I recognized it. And that is that he is a man who pays close attention to big buildings, big factories, and he loves those things. That's what he grew up with, that he built them. He loved that. And what's been bothering him, and you can go back and watch interviews that he did from the late 70s, I think is the earliest one that I've seen, all the way through, he can't stand empty factories anywhere in the United States, and he can't stand to see all of these products coming in from Asia. And that is why he ran. And he believes that to his core. So when he says things like America first, people say, oh, that's just a slogan. Oh, really? Who else was talking about this? And I'll tell you, as somebody who was in Washington, dealt with many of these trade agreements, every president, Republican and Democrat, and I served under, I guess, three different ones. They all said, and every Republican candidate and every Democratic candidate, they all said the same, ridiculous thing that was, we're going to get tough on China. We're really going to get tough. We're going to take it seriously. When I get in there, we're going to stop this unfair trade imbalance with China. Guess what? None of them did a damn thing about it. When Trump got in, he had said the same thing that all the other Republican candidates did. And most of us in Washington Times said, oh yeah, well, that's never going to happen. He's never going to change that. And I'll be damned if he didn't do it. And that was fighting Republicans and Democrats. And he said, look, we're slapping on tariffs on China. He's also, everybody forgets this. He was against the Iraq War from the very beginning. And look, a lot of us who were there at the time, we think that we were led astray. We were lied to, in the United States and officials that were in there. And it's easy playing Monday morning quarterback. But one thing we know is that the United States military can't be turned into a woke nation building type of force. It doesn't work. And if you look the way that we exercise the war on terror, it was not done properly. And President Trump said that for many, many years. So he's a man with very passionate positions that resonate with the American people, that the fake news just says, oh, it's a personality. Well, the more they say that, and they're the ones who weaponize the justice system, when President Trump could have easily went in there and said, we're going to prosecute Hillary Clinton. And he said, look, let bygones be bygones. Let's just get to governing. And look, I bet if he had that to take back, he would have taken that back, knowing now, it's easy looking back, knowing just how corrupt our justice system is and our intelligence agencies in the United States.
Devin, I suspect a lot of people who like and dislike Donald Trump would agree with you that he's very passionate about a lot of issues. My suspicion is that his views on the Iraq War from decades ago now will probably not be what influences the results of the 2024 campaign. And when we look at his popularity, when we look at that personality, which you're saying is the wrong emphasis coming from mainstream media, it does seem to be the case when we look at polling figures that Donald Trump is still quite unpopular. Certainly he's popular at the Republican grassroots right now, but the latest Pew poll says that 63% of the American people find him not so popular. And if we look back on the previous elections, 2016, some of those points you're talking about jobs, energy, he won the election on, albeit by a really small margin across 3 states, but he did win the election on. In 2020, he lost. In 2022, many of his candidates lost. When you look at poll figures like that 63%, even going up against someone like Joe Biden, who isn't very popular himself, are you so convinced that that personality really doesn't matter based on previous performance in several elections? And we're not Republican grassroots, but your average American voter sits now.
Look, it all comes down to where have we come, since 2016. And well, really going back to 2000. I mean, the elections have been very, very close since 2000. I think where you see a lot of that polling, you're going to have the left and the right the left is now very extreme. It's a socialist party. It's not the old Democratic left. And then you're going to have this fight. As long as you have kind of never Trump Republicans out there, you're going to see Donald Trump. He's going to, it'll always be tough for him to get much over 50% in terms of favorability. This is not what it was when Ronald Reagan, or George W. Bush, I think were probably the last two Republicans to have a little bit of a time, above 55% favorability. But, we haven't had a Republican in a long time be at a high favorability. But I feel strongly, as I think a lot of the Trump supporters do, that we should go with the person that we know is going to actually do what he says.
Freddie, what do you make of that? Devin mentioned before he's not convinced that any of the candidates who are taking part in these debates stand a chance at winning the nomination. You write in your piece as well that you're quite skeptical about whether or not these debates can gain traction without Donald Trump. The risk, however, is that you do have people in those debates who have been two-term governors, who are currently governor, who have served in the Senate, who have been elected politicians a lot longer than Donald Trump were, and will have some records to boast about, and may also point out areas where Trump wasn't as successful. Say, he pledged to build a wall. There isn't a wall. And we can go on and on about certain things that were said. Is there any opportunity for one of these candidates, let's even say through a social media clip from the debate, to have some kind of cut through?
I mean, of course there is. There's 11 months to go till the Republican National Convention. There's a whole primary cycle to get through. Obviously, the old cliche, a week is a long time in politics. This is a long time to go through. So it would be idiotic to say that the primaries are done and dusted. But they are done and dusted. No, they're not quite done and dusted.
Do that.
But at the moment, we are heading towards a coronation, not a contest. But to speak to Devin's point about Biden and favorability, I think he's quite right. I mean, the kind of, you mentioned the Pew poll, but the kind of real clear average of polls suggests that Biden is on 54. That's not a huge margin to work with. And other polls that ask people of all independents and so on, that ask people, was the country better under Trump? A lot of people are saying yes. And so if you have that behind you as a candidate, that's a very, very powerful argument.
Freddie, last point, you have a great line in your piece where you say that Trump has destroyed all pretense that television and news was distinct from show business. And I gotta say, I read that and it kind of summed the whole thing up to me, like many, many years of summing up right there. Donald Trump is rude, he's arrogant, he shocks, but a lot of people like it.
Well, exactly. I think what happened in 2015, and this is not a very original point, is that Trump showed that the media had become, the news media had become a bit of a joke. And it's interesting, and if you look at the decade beforehand, two of the big success stories of American news media were Fox News, aimed squarely at conservative viewers, and it did extremely well, and rightly so. But the other one was Jon Stewart's Daily Show, which was one of the most popular news shows in America throughout the 2000s. And that was a satire about how ridiculous the news is. Mm-hmm. And so by the time Trump came along, news was a joke, and he just sort of confirmed...
He combined both.
He combined both, yeah. He made people laugh. And I think people always underestimate that about Trump, is the extent to which he makes people laugh. And it's not necessarily a laughter of endorsement or support or hostility. It's just a fascinating thing to watch.
Freddie and Devin, thanks for joining me.
Hello and welcome to Women with Balls, where I, Katie Ball, speak to today's trailblazers.
Next, political parties are gearing up for a general election next year. Should the Tories be selecting rising Westminster stars or local heroes? James Heale covered this for his politics column this week in the magazine, and he joins me now alongside former MEP and Spectator writer Patrick O'Flynn. James, you write the politics column this week for the magazine, and you say that the Conservatives are embracing local candidates in this election process over established Westminster types. And there seems to be a lot of appeal, this idea that the local candidate will represent local people. But like any choice, there are usually trade-offs. Talk us through it.
Yeah, so this is part of a wider trend, really, and it all, I suppose, goes back to sort of the 1960s, where previously MPs were expected to kind of be, they're parliamentarian, great legislators, etc. And then since then, over the sort of past 5-6 decades, we've seen more and more demands upon MPs to not just live in their constituencies, but also to really take up all their time with casework due to a variety of different factors and influences. And as a result of that, we've now seen, I think, a lot of constituents really wanting to have someone who is going to be a local champion, is what the people describe it as. And I think that the associations find it easier to sell a candidate on the doorstep, quite a cynical age, if at least they're from the area, they know the types, etc. So in 2017, I think about 1 in 3 candidates, Tory candidates, at the election were former or current councillors. And now that's kind of doubled to about sort of 2/3 of all selections that are going on. So there's a huge amount where, once upon a time, it was very fashionable to be a SPAD, and now it seems you're more likely to get selected as a council leader than you are as a special advisor.
So will this be a tactical consideration for people going for certain seats? And it sounds like that's becoming harder and harder if you are a Westminster candidate, so to speak.
I do think so. I think it's notable that most of the kind of Westminster types have actually had some kind of familial or sort of geographical connection. It's a bit like an American presidential contests where they all say that in these sort of key swing states, they have some relation in Pennsylvania, or they're from, somewhere like Nevada, etc. And I think really that's going to be a key thing where those connections really matter. And that's not just because of the attractions of local candidates, but it's also because the fortifications to outsiders have got really harder. So it's hard to go along to a selection meeting, pitch up, have a week to try and charm the association and members there when you're up against someone who's known the area and worked it really for sort of 5-10 years or so. And that's one of the kind of key factors, which is why locals are winning out here.
Patrick, you were, of course, familiar with the MEP selection process, but what do you think of the system overall? Does it work well? And how do you strike the right balance between Westminster politics and local issues when you have the selection process?
Well, I think there is undoubtedly from the grassroots, from the general public, a preference now for local candidates. And it's probably someone in all the party machines has done the maths and worked out that there's a small but potentially meaningful extra vote in real local roots, and not just, my uncle worked in the factory up the road in 1983 sort of thing, but actual provable deep local roots. Now, I kind of slightly bemoan that, and it's funny, James mentions the parachuting SPADs thing as the old way of doing it, but some of us just about remember the idea of the great figures, and you think back to the Wilson and Callaghan cabinet, for example, in the Labour years, and all the big figures around the cabinet table, and the idea of those sort of people, the Dennis Healeys, Tony Benn, being super councillors and seeing their role as that, and indeed their opposite number, the Nigel Lawsons, Thatcher herself, being seen as having to get to that level by being super councillors, rather than people thinking seriously about the future of the country. I think that's the trade-off. I think the individual parties are probably right. It's worth a little premium. If you're in the Tory shoes this time, you're fighting a defensive election, probably you're hanging on to seats where the incumbent MP may have ducked out, and you need to reassure the voters that, we care about your community. So I can see why it's happening. I think as an overall trend in politics, it leaves something to be desired. You wonder where the next generation of leadership caliber people will come from.
And Patrick, now that it is recess, and compared to previous years, it's extremely calm, do you think people are starting to think seriously about the next election and what that looks like? The selection process is, of course, part of that, but more widely speaking, around public policy too.
Yeah, I think the Conservatives are in this strange space where almost every MP realises, apart from a tiny handful of kind of old Boris nostalgists, apart from them, almost everyone realises that to try and change again or to destabilise Rishi Sunak would just look like a massive indulgence, and it's Sunak for the election. But I think under the surface, there's a lot of thinking a lot of scrambling around, a lot of people manoeuvring themselves into position, and I think the who after Rishi question is looming, because, you know, however months we are in, about 8 months, 9 months into a Rishi premiership, you'd be hard to pressed to define Sunakism. And is it a sort of centre technocratic thing that's not that far away from how Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister? And I think if the Conservatives are out of power immediately after the next election, there will be a big conversation in the Conservatives about what do we stand for.
I think Patrick's analysis is really spot on. I think the bigger question comes, what does the future of the party look like? What seats are the Conservatives going to hold on to? If the whole red wall goes blue, that's one scenario. Are they going to lose those seats perhaps which were Lib Dem up until 2015 and then voted, who were quite Brexity and quite Eurosceptic tradition? Would they go Lib Dem again? How many seats are the Blue Lib Dems going to take them off them in the southeast, etc.? And what kind of electoral coalition can the Conservatives really form? And this is all really interesting in the kind of context of candidate selections as well, because I think the Conservatives over the past 4 years have really suffered because they don't really know which way they're supposed to go. Do they lean into realignment? Do they carry on with red wall issues? Is it about migration? Or do those alienate those voters in the southeast of England, where a lot of the cabinet come from, for instance, and all the Lib Dems are really posing a challenge there? So I think it affects everything really, because whoever provides your vote, your members of parliament is going to really, I think, dictate the priorities you choose to articulate in opposition and in government.
James, you write in your column that Rishi Sunak is not anywhere near as directly involved in candidate selection as, say, former Prime Minister David Cameron was with his A-list, which actually led to another former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. But is there another side to this? Might the government be looking at which candidates are being selected by the grassroots, looking at the issues and platforms that they're standing on, seeing what gets some excitement, and then crafting their own manifesto around it?
I think the key difference there between David Cameron and now is government and opposition. Opposition leaders have typically attracted the acclaim of the press and sort of the public by changing their party and then saying, we've changed the party, now we can change the country. So New Labour, New Britain, it's something Keir Starmer's trying to do now by saying, look, I got rid of the Corbynites and some of the less appealing parts of the party. I can now show that I can be a decisive leader in government as well. Simple fact is, after 13 years of government, and particularly exhausting the last few years of government, I think the grassroots has withered to an extent. It's been allowed to atrophy in associations, but also Rishi Sunak as well. I don't think, partly because of his nature, is, as Patrick said, more interested in kind of governing than I think pure politics. And I think the politics and scheming of, say, reshuffles are not necessarily the ones that he would perhaps be always play to his strengths. So I think that in terms of what the grassroots offer, I don't think there's much of a kind of feedback mechanism necessarily. I think that currently everyone mostly is distracted by what's going on in government and really fighting the sort of national issues, the national air war, things like that CCHQ are involved in, rather than kind of 15 years ago where they were really involved in things such as the Liz Truss election you mentioned in Norfolk, which was the Turnip Taliban episodes, and they were very heavily involved in that.
Patrick, James writes in his column that while some people are thrilled by the idea of a local takeover in these candidate selections, other people are more nervous about diversifying skill sets, diversifying experience. They feel that the Tory party needs people coming from all different walks of life. Does that concern you as well?
Not really. I mean, I think there's a perennial sort of soft power struggle between the different wings of the party, and they'll frame it in their own way. And perhaps there might be a feeling that the centre right might get more people in the slots this time. Personally, I'd be glad of that, and perhaps that the sort of parachuted spads tend to be from in the Tory party, the sort of more Cameroon type people. But for instance, I look to the recent London mayoral selection, where of the London-based Metropolitan Tory Party had a series of kind of whiz kids they expected to contest the candidacy, who all self-immolated in the campaign, and they ended up with a proper Conservative by mistake in Susan Hall, who has sort of outer London vibe about her. I think that actually could go down very well with the electorate in London, and Susan Hall, as that kind of outer London beyond Zone 2 candidate, has got that kind of local appeal and taps into something cultural. If the Conservatives produce a few dozen Susan Halls in provincial seats, I think there'll be people in London in the Conservative Party who are fretting about that, but I actually think on the ground it could appeal very much to some of the new Tory coalition that they've been rather careless about preserving.
But James, you mentioned in your column that one quite important group that isn't being selected as voters lean towards more local candidates is women. Is that going to be a problem?
I think so, in the context of, for most of the past 70 years since World War II, the Conservatives consistently did better among women voters than men voters. And that's been reversed in the past 5-6 years or so. And what we've seen from the selections thus far is about 20% or so of the candidates, 25% have been women, which is about less than the proportion they have in Parliament. And it's supposedly a name of the Conservatives to try to get more women in. I think, look, the Conservatives always disdain things like all-women shortlists. They want to talk about being selected for their merits. I completely understand that. But I think the problem is if you select you on the basis of geographical diversity and say everyone's local, that can produce one sense of diversity of having voices from across the country. Equally, it means you could get issues where, partly about gender, and interestingly, I think you're twice as many ethnic minority candidates have been selected as female candidates, which is an interesting. It's not. I don't think it's about sort of grassroots prejudices, etc. But there can be overall in patterns if they're represented locally some issues there, and also career backgrounds as well. I mean, you've got jobs, for instance, like the Lord Chancellor job, meant to be a top lawyer filled. I referenced in the column one anecdote about a top London lawyer who wanted to go for a selection, but was told they'd have a minimum level of canvassing requirements, and they've got a very demanding job, lots of hours, and those things can put pressure and mean that there is some concerns in Westminster among the party elite. They wouldn't actually express these publicly most of the time. There is some concern that they're not going to have the leaders of tomorrow that they need if the Conservatives are going to become a vibrant force in the 2020s and 2030s.
Well, indeed, Patrick, when you've written recently about the future of the Tory party and its philosophical ideas, you have suggested that people like Kemi Badenoch and Penny Mordaunt and Suella Braverman, these women are going to put a big stamp on the party in their own way. It is that reminder that the selections that are being made now will impact who becomes a future leader and who becomes the big voices in the Tory party in 10, 15 years' time.
Well, absolutely. I think after a defeat, we can see with what's happened to Labour after defeats, a party tends to go for someone they ideologically admire. I mean, in Labour's case, you had Ed Miliband and then you had Jeremy Corbyn. Now, obviously, the difference is the Tory selection and election procedure for a leader gives MPs something of a chokehold on who gets put in front of the members. So I think we can expect, one sort of a centrist and one centre-right candidate to go through. Looking at it from here, it would look to me like it'll be Kemi Badenoch against Penny Mordaunt is the most likely thing.
I think it all depends on really which MPs are going to be there, not just geographically and ideologically, but also what's the scale of defeat if it is a defeat. I think a 280 seat party looks very different from a 230 or 180 seat, and depends if they're thinking is this going to be a two-term opposition or a one-term. I think it's a one-term in which the Sunak government is then think it actually did quite well as a result. You're more likely to get someone like James Cleverly. Conversely, I think it could be a more radical direction, departure from the direction of the leadership if it's a pretty bad result.
James and Patrick, thanks for joining me. And finally, following comments made by the actress in the upcoming remake of Snow White, who has branded the original story's prince as a stalker, many are starting to wonder if Disney has been carried away with the culture wars. Journalist Katherine Dee joins me on the show. Katherine, I don't know about you, but as a kid, I loved the Disney princesses. But it's very popular now to make feminist critiques of these characters. I remember going to see the live-action version of Beauty and the Beast, which I was kind of nervous about because Beauty and the Beast is easily my favorite Disney film. And I was pleasantly surprised, and I thought they really brought out the already existing undertones of feminism in Beauty and the Beast. And a few moments were quite explicit, but overall that plot line remained pretty intact. It does seem like plot lines and new characters being added is becoming a popular thing to do with these newer Disney remakes, however. And I wonder if you think there's pressure coming from the public, coming from former Disney watchers, when they were kids, grown-ups now, to make those changes. Or if it's not coming from them, where is it coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is fandoms. So the people who are really the hardcore fans, Disney adults, the marketing teams will send people out into sort of these online communities, and they're much more progressive and much more left-leaning than a general audience, right? So it's very popular to see these types of reimaginings reflected in fan art and fan fiction. And I think the idea is they want to appeal to the hardcore Disney Gen Z fan. But it's sort of myopic because probably the nostalgic millennial fan would be more likely to to actually go to a theater, right? So I think it's like just completely botched marketing attempts.
This is all in the news again because an actress named Rachel Zegler, who plays Snow White in next year's Disney release, has made some comments to the press which were quite controversial. We're going to listen to them now.
The original cartoon came out in 1937, and very evidently so. There is a big focus on her love story with a guy who literally stalks her. Yeah. Weird. She's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be.
So Ziegler's Snow White is not dreaming about true love. She actually brands the prince a stalker. But she's dreaming of the leader she knows she can be. What do you make of these comments?
Well, she's definitely a Zoomer, right? I mean, I thought the comments were like very annoying, right? Like she obviously is sort of like an obnoxious character, but I thought maybe like the reaction to it was even more interesting. Like the dialogue that it created was more interesting than her sort of offhanded or like kind of smug commentary.
Well, there has been a lot of backlash to her comments. Do you think this is the tipping point for Disney? Do you think they might realize that it's gone too far? I mean, no one's seen the new Snow White. It's not out till 2024, so we have to make assumptions about what might be in it. But her comments to the press do suggest that they have completely overthrown the storyline of Snow White, and perhaps actually people were keen to see something that resembled the original.
Yeah, I mean, I think people get excited to see like these sort of shot by shot remakes tend to do very well, like you mentioned, Beauty and the Beast. But my problem with these live action reimaginings is that they feel very sort of like factory made, right? There's just no passion in them, right? And then on top of it, they're completely unrecognizable. It's the political message is like very ham-fisted. It's unclear to me why there hasn't been a tipping point already, because people just aren't, like, audiences just aren't enjoying these new films, right? Like there's no appeal to them. As far as like Ziegler's comments being some sort of tipping point, maybe, especially because it feels like she herself somehow has like created this cottage industry of like angry 30-somethings. Like I was looking through TikTok when this just happened, and it's like if you just type in Rachel Ziegler's name, it's like every person who was born after between like 1986 and like 1994 was just like so pissed at her. I've never seen anything like it. And meanwhile, Zoomers were kind of just like, we weren't going to see this movie anyway.
There's an irony here too, as Disney tries to become more progressive with its live action remakes, that it actually is overlooking some pretty fundamental human rights questions. So, for example, there's a lot of pushback to the film Mulan because Disney decided to do some of its filming in Xinjiang in China, which is famously where the Uyghur camps are located. And I think quite rightly, a lot of people said, let's get back to basics here. Human rights abuses are taking place where you're filming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think Disney is like authentically woke or progressive or whatever you want to call it. I think that they are like, how do we get butts in seats in theaters, right? And that's sort of the like more sinister thing about it. Like not only, I saw a video where someone was like, Walt Disney would be rolling in his grave. And I think he would be rolling in his grave not only because these movies sort of betray the original spirit, but because it's like this mass-produced, it's an insult to the artists who clearly were very passionate about the sort of the original stories, right? It's, to me, it's almost an insult to the word film to call them films.
I think it's very easy to go back and watch older TV shows and films and find the flaws. We've seen this done with Friends recently. We've seen it done with Monty Python, and now we're seeing it happen with Disney. And you can be almost certain that if you do this, you are going to find problems. You are going to find things that would not be made today. You're going to find offensive and inappropriate content that we would all agree just simply would not be made now. And I would also add that for Disney, it went through a particularly grim period around Jim Crow, where there was content that you would simply not want to remake today. That strikes me as quite different from what seems to be happening with Snow White and what we're getting a glimpse of, which is that the storyline is being rejected because it's based on a premise that a love story is good enough to base a film around, as if the concept of traditional romance is in and of itself not especially feminist. And I wonder if this act of dismissing true love completely as something that just isn't worthy enough to be your film premise is actually a disservice. And I question not wanting kids to see that. Keira Knightley made comments a while back saying that she wouldn't want her daughters to watch Disney films anymore. And that strikes me as perhaps one of the strangest aspects of all of this, is that from the original Beauty and the Beast to the original Mulan to Meg and Hercules, I think you actually have some very strong, quite feminist characters. It just wasn't so explicitly laid out that way. The storyline itself, the way that the characters were written, it was almost implicit. But because it wasn't being laid out on a platter saying, look at this, this is a progressive message, people somehow take issue with it. I don't know. I prefer my storylines for kids and for adults when there's a bit more nuance.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of Disney movies actually really hold up a lot better than people think. Like you mentioned Friends. Friends is a very funny example because Friends is one of the only examples of this happening where it like really didn't age well. But if you go back and watch like Beauty and the Beast or Mulan, like you mentioned, it doesn't feel like you're not cringing through it. Like it feels very timeless.
Indeed. Well, we'll just have to wait and see what the new Snow White holds in store. Katherine, thanks for joining me. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.